My son called me from the other room and said, "Dad, come look at this." His voice had something in it I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, that flat, careful tone he used when he didn't want to scare me. I was in the kitchen making coffee. It was a Sunday morning in late October, and the leaves outside the window had gone the color of rust. I remember that detail because I've thought about that morning 1,000 times since, and the leaves are always there when I replay it. I set down my mug and walked to the living room. He was sitting at the dining table with my old iPhone, the one I'd asked him to wipe and set up for his daughter, my granddaughter, who was turning 8 in 2 weeks. A starter phone, nothing fancy. I'd backed everything up to my new device months ago, or thought I had. He held the screen up to me without saying a word. I squinted at it. Reading glasses were on the counter. I leaned closer. It was a screenshot. My bank account summary, the one from my credit union, the one I'd had for 31 years. Full balance visible. Account number visible. The date on the screenshot was March 4th. 4 months before my fiancée Nadine had moved into my house. I said, "Where did you find that?" he said. "There's more, Dad. I should tell you about Nadine first, because none of what comes after makes sense without understanding how good things seemed. I met her 2 years ago at a grief support group that my doctor had referred me to after my wife passed. Lung cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end. My wife was the kind of woman who made everything look easy. Raising our son, keeping the house, working part-time at the school library, remembering every birthday of every person she'd ever met. When she died, I didn't know how to buy groceries. I'm not exaggerating. I stood in the cereal aisle of the Kroger on Route 9 for 15 minutes because she always picked the cereal and I had no idea what kind we bought. The grief group met on Thursday evenings in the basement of a Lutheran church in town. I live in a mid-sized city in central Ohio. Not a small town where everyone knows everything, but not a place where you can disappear either. The group was mostly women. A couple of retired men, a younger guy who'd lost his father. I sat in the back row for 6 weeks before I said a single word. Nadine lost her husband to a heart attack 3 years before I met her. She was 53, I was 58. She had warm eyes and a laugh that came easy, and she told the group she'd learned to stop waiting for life to feel normal again and had decided to just build a new one. I wrote that down in the little spiral notebook I carried. I thought it was the most sensible thing I'd heard in months. We started talking after sessions. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into weekends. By the second year, my son had met her and liked her. My sister had met her and approved. Nadine got along with my granddaughter, who is shy around new people and doesn't warm up easily. That mattered to me more than anything else. I asked her to marry me at the kitchen table, no restaurant, no crowd. Just the two of us in a ring that had belonged to my mother, she cried. I cried. It was a Tuesday night in August and the window was open, and you could hear the neighbors' kids playing outside. We set the date for the following spring. The phone in my son's hand had a folder I didn't recognize. He explained it to me slowly, the way you explain something to someone who's been told bad news and needs time to catch up. The cloud backup on my old phone hadn't transferred cleanly to the new device. Some files had stayed behind, including a shared album that Nadine had created on my phone without telling me. She'd had access to my device one weekend when I was sick with a bad flu and she'd offered to manage some things for me. Prescription refill, a couple of bill payments. I'd given her my passcode because I trusted her completely. The shared album had screenshots going back 14 months. Screenshots of my credit union balance. My brokerage account, the one with the money from selling the house my wife and I had owned before we downsized. My pension paperwork. A photo of the deed to my current home. A photo of the folder I kept in my filing cabinet, the one with my life insurance policy, beneficiary form still showing my son's name. And there were messages, not to me, to someone she called L in her contacts. I had to read them 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. The messages went back 11 months. L turned out to be a man named, and I had my son check this because I needed to be sure. A man my son traced through a mutual connection on Facebook. His name was Lester. He was 56. He lived 40 minutes away in a town called Marysville. He and Nadine had been together on and off for about 4 years, before me, during me. The messages weren't what you'd expect from a couple carrying on behind someone's back. There wasn't much romance in them. What there was planning. He has more than I thought, Nadine had written 10 months ago. The brokerage alone is substantial. Lester had replied, "Are you sure he'll go through with it? Older guys get cold feet. He won't. He's lonely. He just wants someone there. I can work with that." I stood in my own dining room reading those words and felt something I can only describe as the floor moving, not spinning, just dropping an inch like a step you didn't know was there. My son put his hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything. He's 29 years old and he's wiser than I give him credit for. "Keep reading," I said. He scrolled. In Ohio, what a spouse acquires before marriage is generally considered separate property. But what we own together after the wedding, what gets cumulated, what ends up in a joint account, that becomes marital property. Someone had explained this to Nadine, because in one message she wrote to Lester, "Once we're married and I'm on the accounts, it changes everything. Even if he tries to protect it with an agreement, the house is the house." She had not, in 14 months of being my fiancée, once asked me about a prenuptial agreement. I had assumed that was because she didn't need one. She had her own savings, her own small pension from a job she'd worked for 20 years. I had assumed she wasn't thinking about money at all. I had assumed wrong about nearly everything. I did not call her. I want to be clear about that. Every instinct I had said to pick up the phone and demand an explanation, and I made myself not do it. My son drove me to my attorney's office that same afternoon. I've known my attorney for 18 years. She handled my wife's estate. She helped me with the house sale. She's practical and direct and doesn't soften things to spare your feelings, which is exactly what I needed that day. I sat across from her desk and showed her the screenshots from the phone. She looked at everything for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Okay, here's where you stand." She told me that Ohio is an equitable distribution state, which means that in a divorce, the court divides property fairly, not necessarily equally. Separate property, meaning things I owned before the marriage, generally stays mine. But if separate funds get deposited into joint accounts, or if the family home gets refinanced with both names, it complicates things significantly. A long marriage makes it even more complicated. "The wedding is in April," I said. "Then you have time," she said, "but not a lot." She told me the most important thing I could do immediately was document everything. Account balances, property titles, beneficiary designations, and make sure nothing changed without my knowledge. She also said I should strongly consider having her draw up a prenuptial agreement. I said, "She'll know something is wrong." My attorney looked at me and said, "Something is wrong." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "What are my options?" I drove home that evening through the kind of Ohio dusk that's more gray than gold. The sky low and the streetlights already on even though it was barely 5 o'clock. Nadine's car was in the driveway. The kitchen light was on. She had a key. She spent 4 nights a week at my house, had been doing so for the past 8 months. I sat in the driveway for a few minutes. Then I went Sheen dinner. Pasta, which she knew I liked. She had the radio on, the old station that plays standards, because she knew I liked that too. She turned when I came in and smiled at me and said, "You're just in time. How was your day?" I said, "Not bad. Long." I ate dinner at my own table across from the woman who had spent the last year photographing my financial documents to send to another man. I kept my face neutral. I talked about the weather. I talked about my granddaughter's birthday coming up. Nadine talked about a movie she wanted to see. The pasta was good. After dinner, I said I was tired and went to bed early. I lay in the dark for a long time. My wife and I had slept in that room for 19 years. The ceiling had a hairline crack above the window that I'd always meant to patch and never did. I stared at the crack and thought about what I was going to do. It took me 3 weeks. My attorney drafted a prenuptial agreement. It was thorough. It clearly defined my separate property, the house, the brokerage account, my pension, my mother's ring. It stipulated that separate funds would remain separate even if deposited into a shared account. It wasn't punitive. It was simply clear. I also had the locks rekeyed quietly, keeping a spare key available so Nadine wouldn't notice. I changed the passcode on my phone. I updated my filing system so that sensitive documents were no longer in the cabinet she could access. My son helped me with the brokerage account. We added an extra layer of verification that would alert me to any attempted changes. 3 weeks after finding those screenshots, on a Sunday afternoon when Nadine was at my house, I sat down with her at the kitchen table. I put the prenuptial agreement in front of her. I watched her face. There are moments in your life when you see someone shift, when the version of themselves they've been showing you steps back and something else steps forwards. I saw it happen. It was only a second, maybe less. Then she smiled and picked up the papers and said, "What's this?" I said, "Something my attorney recommends before the standard protection for both of us." She leafed through the pages. The smile held but didn't move. "Seems pretty one-sided," she said. "My attorney should look at it." "Of course," I said. She took the papers. She said she'd have her attorney review them. She kissed me on the cheek when she left that evening. At the door, she turned and said, "You know I love you, right?" I said, "I know." She never had an attorney look at the agreement. What she did instead, I found out later, was call Lester. My son, who I don't want to get further into this, had set up a way to monitor activity on my home Wi-Fi. I know this raises questions. I'm not going to defend the method. I'm going to tell you what we learned. She called Lester the evening she left my house with the prenuptial papers. The call lasted 43 minutes. I don't have a recording of it, but I know it happened, and I know she drove to see him 2 days later. 2 weeks after that, she came to me and said she'd been thinking, and she felt the prenuptial agreement was a sign that I didn't fully trust her, and she wasn't sure she could marry someone who didn't trust her. I said, "I understand." She looked surprised. I think she expected me to argue, to backpedal, to tell her I trusted her completely and we could tear up the agreement and forget it. I said, "I understand if you need to step back. I want you to be comfortable." She left that evening and didn't come back. 3 days later, I received a text message asking if we could talk about things. I replied that I thought it was best if we both took some time. She sent 2 more messages after that. I didn't respond to either. I filed a report with the local police. My attorney had encouraged me to document everything, and I did. The screenshots from the phone, the messages, the timeline. I'm not going to tell you the investigation moved quickly, because it didn't. These things rarely do. but having it on record mattered. What I can tell you is that Lester had done something similar before. Not with the same woman, but the same pattern. An older man, recently widowed, introduced through a social group. The prior incident hadn't resulted in charges. The man had declined to pursue it, but there was a record. My attorney connected me with the previous man's son, who confirmed what had happened. I spoke to that man on the phone once. He was 71, living in a retirement community outside Columbus. He'd lost $40,000 before he figured out what was happening. He told me he'd been too embarrassed to tell anyone for almost a year afterward. I told him I was sorry. He said, "Don't be sorry. Just make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." I'm trying. I want to tell you about my granddaughter's birthday, because I don't want this story to end in a courthouse or a police report. She turned 8 on a Saturday in November at my house, with the backyard decorated with paper lanterns my son had strung between the trees. My daughter-in-law made the cake, chocolate with orange frosting, because that's what my granddaughter had requested. And she is not a child who changes her mind. It was cold enough for jackets, but not cold enough to move everything inside. I stood at the kitchen window watching the kids run around the yard and thought about what the last few months had cost me, and whether I'd actually lost anything I needed. The ring, my mother's ring, I'd gotten back before Nadine left. She hadn't taken it. Maybe she knew. Maybe she'd already accepted that the plan had changed. I put it back in the jewelry box in my dresser, next to a photograph of my wife from 1987, before we were married, when she was 24 years old and laughing at something off camera, and I have never once known what was funny. My granddaughter came running inside to get her juice cup and saw me standing at the window. She stopped and looked at me the way kids look at adults when they suspect something is happening that no one will explain. She said, "Grandpa, are you okay?" I said, "Better every day, sweetheart." She seemed to accept that, grabbed her cup, and ran back outside. I watched the paper lantern swing in the November wind and thought about my wife, and thought about the grief group where I'd sat in the back row for 6 weeks too afraid to speak, and I thought about how much time I'd already spent waiting for life to feel normal again. My son came to stand beside me. He handed me a cup of coffee and didn't say anything. After a while, he said, "You doing all right?" I said, "Yeah, I think so." He nodded. He looked out the window at his daughter running circles around the yard with her friends. He said, "She asked me if you were going to be lonely now." I said, "What did you tell her?" He smiled. "I told her you've got us." That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, as it turned out, the thing I'd had all along without fully understanding it. Right there in the backyard, orange frosting and paper lanterns, and the smell of November air coming through the kitchen door, and the hairline crack in the ceiling above the window still waiting to be patched. Maybe I'd get to it this spring.